It started like any other Tuesday evening. Emma had just returned home from work, her arms full of grocery bags, carefully balanced as she nudged the door open with her shoulder. The smell of garlic lingered in the air. David must have started dinner. That small, familiar detail brought her a moment of comfort. Their lives were simple, predictable even. 10 years of marriage had settled them into a rhythm. Work, home, the occasional weekend getaway, nothing extraordinary. But Emma thought that was what marriage was. A quiet partnership, a life built on small moments of trust and understanding. She set the bags down on the kitchen counter and called out, "Hey, I'm home. Need help with dinner?" David's voice came from the living room. "No, it's under control. Just relax. We'll eat soon." Emma smiled to herself as she unpacked the groceries, her mind wandering to their weekend plans. A day trip to the lake, something they'd both been looking forward to for weeks. David loved the outdoors, and Emma loved the way he seemed more carefree when they were out of the city. She was pulling a bottle of wine from the bag when she noticed David standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He looked tense. His face was unreadable, but his body language was off. Emma straightened up, the wine bottle still in her hand. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of worry that had been instinctive since the early days of their relationship. David hesitated. His eyes flickered to the floor, then back to her. "We need to talk." Those 4 words sent a chill down her spine. "We need to talk" was never the beginning of a light-hearted conversation. She set the wine bottle on the counter and turned to face him fully, crossing her arms as if bracing herself. "Okay," she said cautiously. "What about?" He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling heavily. "I've been thinking about this for a while now. I don't want to drag it out anymore. I think we should get a divorce." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air out of her lungs. Divorce? The word sounded foreign, impossible, like something that happened to other people, not to them. She stared at him, her brain scrambling to process what he'd just said. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David didn't look away, but there was no warmth in his gaze, no reassurance to soften the blow. "I've been unhappy for a long time, Emma. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but I can't keep pretending everything's okay." Emma blinked rapidly, trying to stop the tears that were already welling up in her eyes. "Unhappy?" she repeated, her voice shaking. "David, if you're unhappy, why didn't you tell me? We could have worked on it. We could have gone to therapy or—" "I don't think therapy will fix this," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "This isn't about fixing something that's broken. It's about me realizing that I don't want to stay in this marriage anymore. I've made up my mind." Emma's hands were trembling now, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been feeling this way?" David hesitated again, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "A couple of years," he admitted. "I didn't want to hurt you, and I thought maybe it was just a phase, but it's not. I can't keep living like this, Emma. I need to move on. And so do you." Her head was spinning. A couple of years? He'd been feeling this way for years and hadn't said anything? The realization felt like a betrayal, as if the man she'd shared her life with had been living a double life, hiding his true feelings behind a facade of normalcy. "Move on?" she echoed, her voice breaking. "Move on to what, David? What does that even mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a small card out of his pocket and held it out to her. "This is the contact information for my lawyer. I've already started the process and he can explain everything to you. I'm hoping we can keep this amicable." Emma stared at the card as if it were a grenade he'd just placed in her hand. The idea that he'd not only decided to leave her but had already taken steps to make it official was too much to bear. Her vision blurred as tears spilled down her cheeks, and she slapped the card out of his hand. It fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. "You've already talked to a lawyer?" she demanded, her voice rising in anger. You made this decision without even giving me a chance to fix things? Without even telling me?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to blindside you, Emma, but I needed to make sure I was doing this the right way. I've been over this 100 times in my head. This isn't something I'm doing lightly." "Lightly?" she snapped. "You're destroying our life, David. How am I supposed to believe you didn't take this lightly when you've been planning it behind my back?" The room fell silent except for the sound of Emma's ragged breathing. David bent down to pick up the card and placed it on the counter. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But this is what I want, Emma. I don't want to fight with you. I just want us to end this with as little pain as possible." "As little pain as possible?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You think there's a way to make this painless? You think handing me a lawyer's card and telling me you've been miserable for years is going to hurt any less because you said it calmly?" David didn't respond. He just stood there, looking at her with a mixture of guilt and resolve. Emma wanted to scream, to throw something, to shake him and demand answers, but she could see from the set of his jaw that he wasn't going to change his mind. This was happening, whether she liked it or not. Finally, she sank onto one of the kitchen chairs, her hands covering her face. The tears came in earnest now, hot and bitter, and she didn't have the strength to hold them back. David didn't move to comfort her, and that hurt more than anything else. For the first time in their marriage, she felt truly alone. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes and looked up at him. "What about the lake trip?" she asked, her voice small and broken. It was a ridiculous question, but it was the only thing she could think to say. David's face softened, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of regret. "I think we should cancel," he said quietly. "It's not fair to either of us to pretend everything's okay." Emma nodded slowly, her mind already retreating into a fog of disbelief and grief. She didn't have the energy to argue anymore. All she could do was sit there and watch, as the life she thought she had unraveled before her eyes. The morning after David dropped the bombshell, Emma woke up to an unfamiliar heaviness in her chest. For a few blissful seconds, as her eyes adjusted to the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, she forgot everything, but then reality crashed back in. David wanted a divorce. He had contacted a lawyer. He had been unhappy for years. Her hand instinctively reached for the other side of the bed, only to find it empty. David had slept in the guest room. Or maybe on the couch. It didn't matter. The space he had occupied for the past 10 years now felt like a stranger's. She lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling paralyzed by the weight of what was coming. She didn't know where to begin, or how to process the previous night's conversation. Eventually, she forced herself to get up. She shuffled into the kitchen, where the remnants of their life together mocked her. The half-empty wine bottle sat on the counter, unopened. The card with his lawyer's information was still there, too. She stared at it for a long time before finally picking it up. The name of the lawyer, Michael Conrad, was printed in neat bold lettering, along with a phone number and address. She turned her back on him. Her stomach churned. She wasn't ready to call this man, this stranger who already knew more about her marriage's end than she did. But what choice did she have? David had made it clear that he was moving forward, with or without her cooperation. She set the card down and reached for her phone. The idea of calling David's lawyer felt like a betrayal of herself, but Emma knew she needed to understand what was happening. Her fingers hovered over the keypad for what felt like an eternity before she finally dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a polished, professional voice answered. "Law offices of Michael Conrad, how may I assist you?" Emma cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she replied. "Hi, this is Emma." "Emma Harper. My husband, David Harper, told me to call. He said you're handling his divorce." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make her feel even more uncomfortable. Yes," the receptionist said, her tone now slightly warmer. Mr. Harper has retained Mr. Conrad's services. Let me transfer you to his office. One moment, please." The line clicked, and soft hold music filled the silence. Emma gripped the edge of the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She was about to talk to the person orchestrating the end of her marriage. "Emma Harper," a deep, measured voice said, breaking through the music. "This is Michael Conrad. Thank you for calling. I understand this must be a difficult time for you." Difficult didn't begin to cover it. But instead of saying that, Emma forced herself to respond. "Yes, it is. David told me to contact you so I could, I don't know, discuss the process, I guess?" "Of course," Michael said, his tone calm and reassuring, like he'd had this conversation 100 times before. "I've been retained by your husband to facilitate an amicable divorce. Our goal is to reach an agreement that works for both parties without unnecessary conflict or litigation. Have you consulted your own legal counsel yet?" Emma blinked, caught off guard. "No, I haven't even thought about that yet." "That's understandable," he said. "It's common for people to feel overwhelmed at the start of this process. I would recommend that you speak with an attorney to represent your interests. While I will work to ensure a fair resolution, my primary responsibility is to Mr. Harper." The words stung, more than she expected. Of course he was David's lawyer. Of course his job was to protect David's interests. Still, hearing it said so plainly made her feel like she was already at a disadvantage. Michael continued, his tone professional but not unkind. "To begin, we'll need to discuss the division of assets, spousal support, and any other considerations. David has expressed a desire to move forward quickly, but we'll proceed at a pace that works for both of you. If you'd like, I can email you a preliminary outline of the proposed terms." Eva hesitated. Part of her wanted to hang up the phone and pretend this wasn't happening, but she knew she couldn't do that. "Okay," she said finally. "You can send it to me." "Very well. I'll have it sent over by the end of the day. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out." The call ended shortly after that, leaving Emma feeling drained and more lost than ever. She sat down at the kitchen table, staring at her phone as if it might give her answers. Instead, it buzzed with an incoming text from David. "David, did you talk to Michael?" Emma's fingers hovered over the screen. She wanted to ignore him, to punish him with silence, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. "Emma, yes." His response came almost immediately. "David, thank you. I know this is hard." Hard didn't even begin to describe it. But Emma didn't reply. She couldn't. For the rest of the day, she moved through life in a fog. The email from Michael arrived in the late afternoon, just as he'd promised. She opened it hesitantly, her stomach knotting as she skimmed the contents. It was cold, clinical, and impersonal, outlining the division of their property, the dissolution of joint accounts, and even suggestions for spousal support. Reading it made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just an idea or a bad dream. This was happening. Her marriage was unraveling, and she was powerless to stop it. That evening, as she sat alone in the living room, Emma realized she needed help. She couldn't navigate this on her own. She pulled out her laptop and started searching for divorce attorneys in the area. The process felt surreal, like she was stepping into someone else's life. After an hour of searching, she settled on a firm that specialized in family law. Their website emphasized compassion and support, two things Emma desperately needed. She filled out the contact form and scheduled a consultation for later that week. When she finally went to bed that night, she felt a small flicker of relief. She didn't know what the future held, but at least she had taken the first step toward reclaiming some control. The next morning, Emma woke up to a text from her best friend, Sarah. "Sarah, hey, are you okay? You've been quiet." Emma stared at the message, debating whether to tell her. In the end, she typed out a response, before she could second-guess herself. "Right. Emma, no, I'm not okay. David wants a divorce." The reply came almost instantly. "Sarah, I'm coming over." Within an hour, Sarah was at her door, armed with coffee, pastries, and a fierce determination to be there for her friend. As Emma recounted everything, the bombshell, the lawyer, the cold email, Sarah listened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "That asshole," Sarah said, shaking her head. "He's been unhappy for years, and he never said a word. What kind of coward does that?" Emma shrugged, tears welling up again. "I don't know. Maybe I should have seen it coming." "No," Sarah said firmly. "This is not your fault. He's the one who checked out without telling you. You deserve better than this." For the first time in days, Emma felt a small glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but with Sarah by her side and a lawyer in her corner, she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. Emma wasn't sure when the shock turned into something else: anger, determination, or perhaps a mix of both. After her conversation with David's lawyer, Michael Conrad, and her own subsequent decision to hire legal counsel, the numbness that had gripped her in those first few days began to fade. What replaced it was a burning need for answers. If David was so sure he wanted a divorce, if he had been unhappy for years, as he claimed, there had to be more to the story. For 10 years, Emma had thought she knew her husband inside and out. They'd shared everything: dreams, frustrations, mundane details about their daily lives. And yet, now it felt like she was staring at a stranger. How could he hide such a massive part of himself from her? The question gnawed at her, refusing to let go. It started small. She couldn't stop replaying his words from that fateful night in the kitchen. "I've been unhappy for a long time." How long, exactly? What had changed? The more she thought about it, the more she began to notice things she had overlooked in the past year or two: odd absences, vague excuses, the way he sometimes avoided eye contact when she asked about his day. At the time, she'd dismissed those moments as normal hiccups in a long-term relationship. Now they seemed like clues she should have picked up on earlier. One afternoon, after her lawyer had walked her through the basics of preparing for the divorce proceedings, Emma found herself staring at David's laptop on the desk in the home office. He'd left it behind that morning when he went to stay with a friend, a decision he made to "give us space," as he'd put it. She'd never been the type to snoop, but something inside her shifted that day. If David had been hiding something, maybe the answers were right here, hidden in plain sight. Her hands trembled as she opened the laptop. It wasn't password protected, which surprised her. A small part of her still felt guilty, like she was crossing a line, but the larger part, the part that demanded the truth, pushed her forward. At first, she didn't find anything unusual. His email inbox was filled with work correspondence, promotional offers, and the occasional bill reminder. His browsing history was similarly unremarkable: news articles, a few YouTube videos, and some online shopping sites. Just as she was about to give up, Emma noticed a folder tucked away on the desktop, labeled Personal. Her stomach churned as she clicked on it. Inside were several subfolders, most of which contained innocuous things: tax documents, scanned receipts, even a few old photos from their early years together. But one folder, titled Drafts, caught her attention. When she opened it, Emma froze. Inside were several unsent emails, all addressed to a woman named Vanessa. Her heart pounded as she clicked on the first email. It was dated 3 months ago and read, "Vanessa, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I hate the lying, but I don't see another way. Every time I look at her, I feel like the worst person in the world. I know we agreed to wait, but it's getting harder to pretend. I need you to know how much you mean to me." The email ended there, unfinished. Emma stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. Who was Vanessa? And what, exactly, had David been pretending about? She opened the next email, then the next. Each one painted a clearer picture, though none of them outright stated the nature of their relationship. It was obvious, though. Vanessa wasn't just a friend or colleague. She was someone David had feelings for. someone he had been emotionally and possibly physically involved with while still married to Emma. Emma's hands clenched into fists as a wave of anger washed over her. All the pieces started falling into place. The late nights at the office, the unexplained business trips, the sudden emotional distance. He hadn't been unhappy for years because of her or their marriage. He'd been unhappy because he was living a double life. Her first instinct was to call him, to demand an explanation, but she stopped herself. She needed to think this through. What good would it do to confront him without a plan? Instead, Emma saved copies of the emails onto a flash drive and closed the laptop. Later that evening, she confided in Sarah. Her best friend's reaction was predictably furious. "That bastard!" Sarah exclaimed, pacing back and forth in Emma's living room. "He's been cheating on you, and he has the nerve to act like this is all about his unhappiness? Unbelievable." Emma nodded, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I don't even know what to do, Sarah. Part of me wants to confront him, but another part of me I don't know. I feel so stupid for not seeing this sooner." "You are not stupid," Sarah said firmly, sitting down beside her. "He's the one who lied. You trusted him because that's what you're supposed to do in a marriage. This isn't your fault." Emma wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "My lawyer said I need to gather as much information as possible before we go into negotiations. I guess this counts, right?" Sarah nodded. "Absolutely. If he's been unfaithful, that changes everything. You need to make sure you're protected, Emma. Don't let him walk all over you." The following week was a blur of meetings with her lawyer, who assured her that the emails could be valuable leverage during the divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, Emma continued to piece together the truth about David's affair. She discovered through his phone records, another piece of advice from her lawyer, that he had been in frequent contact with Vanessa for at least a year. Eventually, Emma decided it was time to confront him. She invited him over one evening, making it clear that they needed to have an honest conversation. David arrived, looking tense but composed, as if he were preparing for a routine negotiation. "What's this about?" he asked, sitting down at the kitchen table. Emma didn't waste any time. She pulled out the flash drive and slid it across the table. "I found your emails," she said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "To Vanessa." David's face went pale. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it, but then he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I guess there's no point in lying anymore," he said quietly. Emma's hands tightened into fists. "How long has it been going on?" "A little over a year," he admitted. "But it didn't start the way you think. At first it was just talking. We connected at work, and I don't know, Emma. I felt like she understood me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time." "Don't you dare put this on me," Emma snapped. "If you were unhappy, you should have talked to me. You should have tried to fix things instead of sneaking around behind my back." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I handled this wrong. I didn't know how to tell you." "That's a pathetic excuse," she shot back. "You had plenty of chances to be honest, David. Instead, you lied to me and made me feel like this was my fault. Do you even realize what you've done to me?" David didn't respond. He just stared at the table, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For a moment, Emma felt a flicker of satisfaction. He should feel guilty. He should feel... But guilt and shame weren't enough to fix what he had broken. Emma stood up, her voice firm as she said, "I've hired a lawyer, and I'm not going to let you walk all over me. You made your choice, David. Now, you're going to face the consequences." As she watched him leave, Emma felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out now, and while it hurt like hell, it also gave her clarity. She didn't have to wonder anymore. She didn't have to blame herself. David's betrayal had shattered her world, but it had also given her something unexpected, the strength to start rebuilding it on her own terms. The weeks following Emma's confrontation with David were some of the most difficult of her life, but they were also some of the most defining. The truth about his affair with Vanessa had left her feeling raw and hollow, but it had also given her clarity. For the first time in years, Emma stopped wondering what she could have done differently, or where she might have gone wrong. She knew now that the fault wasn't hers to carry. David had made his choices, and now she had to make hers. The divorce process began in earnest, ushering Emma into a world of legal jargon, negotiations, and uncomfortable conversations. Her lawyer, a calm but firm woman named Karen, had been a lifeline. Karen's approach was both strategic and empathetic. She had seen countless women in Emma's position and knew how to guide her through the maze of uncertainty. Emma's focus shifted to practical matters, untangling their finances, deciding what to do with the house, and trying to rebuild her life piece by piece. The emotional weight was ever present, but there was also a sense of purpose that came with taking action. For years she had deferred to David in so many aspects of their life together, letting him take the lead on major decisions, trusting him to have their best interests at heart. Emma had been bringing her these maps for years. They both felt left out of their best interests at heart. Now, for the first time, she was reclaiming her voice. One of the hardest parts of the process was deciding what to do with their home. The two-story house in the quiet suburb had been their sanctuary for the past 8 years. Every corner was filled with memories. Their first Christmas together, the nights they spent painting the walls of the living room, the garden she had tended to with care. Letting it go felt like another loss, another piece of her old life slipping away. But Karen had been blunt. Keeping the house might feel like holding on to stability, she had said, but it's also a huge financial burden, especially if you're planning to start over. Think about what's best for your future, not just your past. Emma hated that she was right, but deep down she knew she couldn't afford the house on her own. David, for his part, seemed relieved when she agreed to sell it. They listed it with a real estate agent and began the grueling process of cleaning and staging it for potential buyers. Packing up their shared life into boxes was bittersweet. Each item she wrapped seemed to tell a story of who they used to be, but it was also cathartic. The more she packed, the more she felt like she was shedding an old skin. David, meanwhile, was still staying with a friend, though Emma suspected he spent most of his time with Vanessa. Their interactions were minimal, limited to the logistics of the divorce. At first, every text or email from him sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through her. How dare he act so casual after everything he had done? But over time, that anger began to morph into something else. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a quiet acceptance. She couldn't change the past, and she couldn't control David's choices. The only thing she could control was how she moved forward. One night, as she was sorting through a box of old photographs, Emma stumbled across an album from their honeymoon. The pictures showed a younger version of herself, wide-eyed and laughing, her arms wrapped around David as they stood on a sun-drenched beach. She stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the couple in the picture with the people they had become. Tears streamed down her face as she flipped through the album, but they weren't just tears of sadness. There was also a deep, aching gratitude for the good times they had shared. Their marriage hadn't been all lies and betrayal. There had been love, too, and that love had shaped her into the person she was today. Letting go of the anger didn't mean excusing David's behavior. It meant freeing herself from the weight of it. As the weeks turned into months, Emma began to feel lighter. She threw herself into her work, taking on new projects and even volunteering for a local nonprofit that helped women navigate life after divorce. The experience was humbling and empowering. Hearing other women's stories reminded her that she wasn't alone, and it gave her the strength to keep moving forward. Her support network grew, too. Sarah was a constant presence, showing up with wine and laughter whenever Emma needed a pick-me-up. Emma's parents, who had been cautiously supportive at first, became her biggest cheerleaders. Even her colleagues rallied around her, surprising her with small gestures of kindness that made the days a little easier. But the most profound change was within herself. Slowly but surely, Emma began to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage. She took up yoga, something she'd always been curious about but never found the time for. She signed up for a photography class at the community center, rekindling a passion she hadn't pursued since college. She even started dating again, though she approached it with caution. The first few dates were awkward, filled with stilted conversation and polite smiles. But one evening, she met a man named Mark, a history teacher with a dry sense of humor and a kind smile. They bonded over their mutual love of classic films and spent hours talking about everything from their favorite books to their most embarrassing moments. It was easy, comfortable in a way Emma hadn't expected. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the possibility of love. By the time the divorce was finalized, Emma was in a completely different place. The settlement had been fair, thanks to her lawyer's meticulous work, and she walked away with enough to start fresh. She used part of the money to rent a cozy apartment downtown, a space that felt entirely her own. Decorating it was a joy. Every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall, was a reflection of her personality. The day the divorce papers arrived in the mail, Emma took a moment to sit quietly and reflect. She didn't cry, though her chest tightened as she read the final document. It was the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of another. That evening, she invited Sarah over to celebrate. They toasted to new beginnings with glasses of champagne, and Emma made a silent promise to herself. She would no longer let her past define her. She would embrace the uncertainty of the future, trusting that she was strong enough to face whatever came next. In the months that followed, Emma continued to build the life she wanted. She grew closer to Mark, though she took things slow, determined not to rush into anything. She poured her energy into her work and her newfound hobbies, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. One afternoon, as she walked through the park near her apartment, Emma paused to watch a group of children playing by a fountain. Their laughter filled the air, and she couldn't help but smile. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had grown since that fateful night when David had shattered her world. She wasn't the same woman she had been back then, but she liked the person she was becoming. She had found strength in herself that she didn't know she had, and though the scars of her marriage would always be a part of her, they no longer defined her. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze against her skin. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace it.